Why the woke crowd is wrong about social justice. Laws, at least, must be colorblind. Entertain me for a moment. Philosophers often use thought experiments or imaginative examples to explore different concepts and ideas. Below, I will follow in the spirit of this with a thought exercise of my own. You should retain it or remember it, as it will be relevant to the arguments that follow later in this article. Our scenario begins with a playground. Add some kids for effect, and to pay homage to Bob Ross, maybe we'll add some trees, nice shades of green with bright colors. There. On this playground, kids can play in relative peace with one another. They can be nasty, as kids often are, but they're subject to the rules of the playground. There is an all-powerful playground entity, the playground's ethics entity, otherwise P, that is responsible for setting down and enforcing the laws that kids must abide by on all playgrounds. You, as someone who pays money to P for the upkeep and regulation of the playground, have some small say in the decisions that they make with their playgrounds. The majority of the persons funding P have kids that play on playgrounds, and most of them have dark hair. Because of that, P has created a rule with the widespread support of the patrons that dark-haired children will receive preference over light-haired children when it comes to playground equipment. Light-haired children can be made to get off the playground equipment when dark-haired children want to use it, and light-haired children only get to use the equipment for a small period of time during regular playground hours. Now, let's say that these types of discriminatory rules exist for decades and shape the playground experience of dark-haired and light-haired children for generations. Over time, opinions start to change as people realize that light-haired children were mistreated and disadvantaged for such a long period of time. This change in mindset or awareness causes a shift where people begin to start pressuring P for change. How can this obvious past discrimination or favoritism be addressed? The most obvious thing to do, firstly, is to abolish any discriminatory rules. This ensures that the rules themselves do not discriminate against any children on the playground. But what about the many decades of lost pleasure or environment of unfairness that light-haired children dealt with on the playground? What if dark-haired children continue to discriminate against light-haired children en masse, even without explicitly discriminatory rules? Surely something can be and should be done about those things. We can, of course, consider some options. Number one, as dark-haired children receive preferential treatment for so long, perhaps to balance out past wrongs, we should give light-haired children now preferential treatment. Perhaps a rule should be made that dark-haired children must vacate playground equipment if a light-hair wants to use it exclusively, and that dark-hairs are forced to now endure restricted hours of playground access for a time to rectify the past mistreatment or lack of hours that light-hairs received over the years. Number two, perhaps to try to rectify past wrongs, some monetary compensation is given to the families of the previously maligned light-hairs, perhaps at the expense of dark-haired parents. Number three, to try to control discrimination against light-hairs by dark-hairs who held past supremacy on the playground via the P rules, one could make a rule that any dark hair found discriminating must suffer some penalty i.e., be removed from the playground, etc. Do you see where this is going yet? If not, buckle up. It's going to be a fairly insightful, but maybe bumpy ride. I hope you packed your hard hat alongside your thinking cap. Regarding solution number 1 and number 2, yes. In this example, the light-haired children were unfairly treated over a period of time. But by reversing the set of affairs and now discriminating against the dark hairs, you are essentially perpetuating the issue. How do you know what the just amount of restitution is? What is the right amount of discrimination that is needed to counterbalance the discrimination of the past and create some good out of it all? Do the dark hairs really bear the onus of having to rectify this wrong? Sure, they benefited from the past rules, but were they really the oppressor? Or does P alone bear the responsibility for creating the harmful rules? If you do adopt the position, which I believe to be mistaken, that you can counterbalance past discrimination with present discrimination, do you really believe, based on its track record, that the entity called P is the best organization to handle that problem? With solution number 2, you're again trying to rectify past harms that have done unquantifiable damage. Additionally, if the onus of paying for the restitution for light hairs is on all patrons of P, you could add insult to injury. Imagine the irony of having the parents of light hairs partially pay for the restitution of their own children. If you make it so that only the parents of the dark hairs must pay monetary compensation to P to cover restitution fees, you have also failed. What about the dark hairs or light hairs that didn't even live in P's jurisdiction when the bad rules existed? Or consider the reality that the group which oppressed the light hairs was never the dark hairs, but rather P itself. That is a point worth noting, one which we will return to shortly. Finally, with the third proposed solution, yes, setting rules against private discrimination makes some rudimentary sense at first glance. But that depends on the type of discrimination and the subject being discriminated over. If a dark hair is trying to prevent a light hair from using a piece of equipment that belongs to the playground, and the dark hair wasn't playing with it first, then he has no right to restrict the light-haired child. The playground equipment is not his property, and vice versa if the tables are turned. But if the dark hair simply discriminates in relation to property which he or she is entitled to, that has no bearing on the rights of the light-haired child to enjoy the P playground. If one has a prior claim on a given resource, even in the playground context, then that confers the power to exclude others from it. To drive this point home, imagine that a dark-haired child refuses to play with a light-haired child. Irregardless of the reason, the dark-haired child has a greater claim to his or her body and time than the light-haired child can ever possess. So the dark-haired child, his refusal to play with the light-haired child, while discriminatory, is valid. The same can be said if the dark-haired child refuses to let the light hair play with any toys that he or she possesses. The dark-haired child, however, cannot restrict the light hair from the playground. They do not have a right to the exclusive control of the playground. I'm assuming you've caught on by now. Yes, I am critiquing much of the anti-racist movement. Or specifically, I'm raising a critical eye toward the types of policy solutions that anti-racist and so-called woke activists advocate. If they ever achieve their conception of an ideal world, the road will be paved with shit, leftist rhetoric, and God complexes. so as to remain charitable to the progressives that I hope to reach, that will be my only disparaging remark for the remainder of this. Arguments must speak for themselves, or they, like an average person trying to lift Thor's hammer, will be unworthy. Recently, in speaking with a person whom I love and admire, we touched upon the subject of minority and female oppression in Western societies. Specifically, the subject of black oppression by whites was raised. While we both agree that black persons historically have been mistreated under the law in this country, and that the ramifications of that are still being felt, her tendency was to blame this on a hypothetical legacy of slavery. Being no stranger to the after effects of slavery and the Jim Crow era, I suggested that government interventionism and legislation had been the main source of the ails of most Americans, but especially minorities. Don't get me wrong. White people, if you want to be so banal and indiscriminate as to lump all persons of European descent under that general heading, did largely hold the reins of power in the United States and most Western countries for the majority of recent history. It is undoubted that since majorities heavily influence the politics of both democracies and republics, their influence over their respective governments has often been to the detriment of minority groups. The Irish, the blacks, the Chinese, the Japanese, Native Americans, Arabic people, etc. But this is a problem of majority rule and not one of white culture per se. After all humans have discriminatory tendencies and a fear or innate disdain for foreign or unknown cultures and peoples. When a minority class tends to fit a category that the majority finds disdainful, repulsive, or worrisome, the majority will use the power they possess from their position of control to subjugate the demonized minorities. The above is true whether the majority is one of white culture, black culture, Asian culture, or whatever. Even if an old minority were to become a new majority, a tendency to weaponize the state would still be the fundamental problem. A society designed to respect the basic rights of all, with an emphasis on equal liberty under the law, is preferable to one subject to the whims and prejudices of the majority, or any power group within society. Apologists for governmental authority often presuppose that the people, in an ideal situation, are the government. But in practice, this is nothing but an unwarranted justification for encroaching oppression. As Murray Rothbard observed in his magnificent Anatomy of the State, pages 10 through 11, we must therefore emphasize that we are not the government. The government is not us. The government does not in any accurate sense represent the majority of the people. But even if it did, even if 70% of the people decided to murder the remaining 30%, this would still be murder and would not be voluntary suicide on the part of the slaughtered minority. No organicist metaphor, no irrelevant bromide that we're all part of one another must be permitted to obscure this basic fact. People can utilize whatever stereotype they want, whatever zeitgeist, whatever explanation for their ails. Democratic governments will capitalize on any story that can aid them and politically run on it if it's popular enough. There's little incentive to actually consider the questions raised by these ailments with reason or a fair mind. Governments exploit the whims and wishes of their supportive base. But, you ask, why is this important to the question of equality under the law? Because the law cannot be subject to the fleeting whims of those who would ignore the rules that allow for basic human peace and prosperity. Even if you fully endorse the ability of a central agency, let's say P, to create an environment of fairness for all people that enjoy their services, you should pause to consider. Getting caught up in identity politics and stereotyping causes one to endorse preconceived theories or hypotheses about disparities, which prevent one from observing reality and judging people and their experiences as individual and specific to them. This is dangerous, as it implies an assumption about someone's story or experience which is held against a perspective or hypothesis that may or may not be true. Many argue for subjects like critical race theory from the standpoint that they are already true, so they make excessive assumptions that may not be warranted. To argue effectively, you must start from the position that your presumptions may not be true, and then argue in favor of them. You should not take a hypothesis, however plausible, as exemplary and then base all deductions from it, as your starting premise may be false. To be sure, many policies were implemented based on racist ideologies. Most persons who support a minimum wage probably do not realize that such laws were originally proposed by the Democratic Party to price minorities out of the market. Black citizens in this country were catching up to their white counterparts in terms of economic well-being and prosperity. So to protect jobs for whites, minimum wage laws were implemented. Sure, the minimum wage laws did not explicitly use racist language, but their effects, when applied to a population that had outcomes diverging along demographic lines, had effects that disproportionately plagued American minorities. Whether intended to discriminate against other races in a modern context or not, the irony is not lost on me that the Democratic Party still endorses that policy, among others that have racist roots. The war on poverty itself tended to perpetuate poverty in this country. Even though the impulse of capitalism is to repel poverty and raise the standard of living for all, a rising tide raises all ships, impediments exist that help keep people in squalor. I've written on this elsewhere in terms of race disparities, but I was perhaps a bit too snarky and inconsiderate. It is, of course, not my job to tread lightly around people's feelings, but being purposely inflammatory is probably antagonistic to my cause. Others, such as Professor Thomas Sowell and Coleman Hughes, are better on the issue of disparities anyway. All the above points aside, victims do deserve restitution. But minority victims today are not victims of slavery, as they never endured it. Perhaps they are victims of the impact of slavery. But the impact of slavery isn't something that can be easily quantified. In fact, the impact of Sherman's march, where his soldiers butchered, burned, and raped everything in sight, can't be quantified either. What if I look white by all external markers, but have black or enslaved ancestors? Perhaps I am a genetic anomaly. Either way, when you meet me in person, what do you assume about me? Have you ever spoken to me or gotten to know me? What do you know about my trials or tribulations? Anything? Oh, you do claim to know something about my privilege or lack thereof? Well, fuck you. Sorry, I said something about not being rude. Even if I myself were a slave owner who actually lived during the time when slavery was law and owned a slave, I would only owe restitution to that particular slave for violating his or her liberty. A murderer is not culpable for all murders at all times, but only the specific victim in the specific place and the specific time. Likewise, We do not try the children of known murderers for crimes that they themselves have not committed. But even if you were to hold the descendants of a murderer accountable for the crimes of their predecessor, you would still have to show evidence of the crime in a specific case and not blame all people of a certain demographic for murder. It's easy to blame someone for a demographic that they happen to belong to. It is much harder to actually sort through the weeds and find genuine blame and legitimate debt from those who deserve blame and possess debt. But that is a requirement of real justice. Claims made, barring legitimate evidence of specific wrongdoing, cannot be used against defendants. Collective guilt is a useless abstraction that can and has been used as a justification to perpetuate injustice. In the long haul, whether I'm a light-haired person or a dark-haired person, what relevance does that have in terms of how we treat one another in a semi-free society? Bad rules can and arguably should be abolished on our playground, but that confers no specific debt to me or to anyone else. Live and love responsibly. I owe you nothing, and you nothing to me.